Hi, my name is Jason Travers. I'm an assistant professor of special education at the University of Kansas, where I teach courses in autism and developmental disabilities. I have a background in applied behavior analysis, and I'm also a former public school teacher. I worked in the Clark County School District for 5 years while I finished up my doctoral degree at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I'm going to be speaking today about responding to problem behavior and understanding its communicative intent. And the title of this brief talk is Turning Problem Behavior into Effective Communication. Before I begin, I'll need to share with you my disclosures. As I stated before, I am an employee of the University of Kansas, and as part of being here today and providing this continuing education opportunity, I am being provided with financial compensation from ASHA. I also have some non-financial disclosures. I am a member of the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and I'm also a member of the Council for Exceptional Children. So as I stated at the beginning, this talk is about functional communication training. And the first thing I want to do is just clarify the potential confusion between this term, functional communication training, and what sometimes or is oftentimes known as facilitated communication. They're sometimes confused and sometimes used interchangeably, but these are two entirely different concepts. Facilitated communication is a thoroughly debunked and inappropriate and non-evidence-based intervention that is being used in some corners of the country and in some school districts, but it is not an evidence-based practice and it should be avoided. What I'll be talking about is called functional communication training, and this is essentially a method for understanding the communicative intent of problem behavior and replacing that problem behavior with something that is more socially appropriate in terms of communication. So for example, if a student is hitting to escape a non-preferred task, then a functional communication training approach would entail teaching the child an appropriate way to communicate their desire to escape the non-preferred task. So right now you're thinking, what? You're going to teach us to tell children that they're not going to do their work? And that is exactly what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm asking you to teach students who are already having difficult behavior that is interfering with their learning, behavior that is communicative in nature. I'm championing the idea that you should adjust your approach and recognize that behavior has some communicative intent and that you can capitalize on the motivation associated with that problem behavior to teach communication skills. It's a little daunting and it's a little scary, but I think by the time we reach the end, you'll have a good understanding of the concept and I think you'll be in agreement. So some preliminary assumptions about a functional communication training approach involve assuming or understanding or recognizing that all problem behavior has a purpose for the person displaying it. So all behavior, everything that the child does has a reason. And there's no such thing as out of the blue behavior. There's no such thing as behavior that occurs for no reason at all. All problem behavior has a function. All problem behavior has a purpose. And our goal is to figure out what the purpose of that behavior is. We usually use a process called functional assessment to identify the purpose or purposes of problem behavior. So by recognizing that problem behavior has a purpose and that the purpose of that behavior has some communicative nature behind it, and by using a formal process for understanding the function of that person's behavior through functional behavior assessment, we can come up with intervention models that work not to just eliminate or reduce problem behavior, but increase communicative behavior. So here we're talking about the goal being focused on educating the child or teaching the child how to communicate, not just focusing on how to decrease their inappropriate behavior. Additionally, it's important to recognize that sometimes people oversimplify this functional approach to behavior. They think a child is having a tantrum, and the tantrum has one purpose: to escape an activity or to escape a demand, or to get something that they want, like a toy or a game. And so they have this narrow idea that one behavior can only have one purpose, and in fact, that's inaccurate. A single behavior can have multiple purposes. A tantrum can serve the purpose of getting something like a preferred toy or getting a snack, while also serving to escape a demand or escape the attention of a teacher who's enforcing that demand. So rather than responding individually to single behaviors or one behavior in a kind of singular way, what I would like for you to do is focus on understanding why behavior is occurring in context so that you can understand what the message is, and then you can begin teaching a replacement skill that communicates the same message. So the goal isn't necessarily to reduce problem behavior, although that's a positive byproduct. The goal is instead to change the systems that are surrounding the child, to change the environment surrounding the child so that they're better able to communicate. Essentially what we're talking about is doing intervention with someone and not to someone. So we work with the child, we work with the teachers, we work with the folks involved in the child's support team, and we develop a plan of intervention and we provide changes to the environment. We're not doing something to the child. We're not trying to change the child or change what they want or change how they feel. We're simply trying to help them learn how to communicate by changing their environment. So essentially, the overarching goal of functional communication training is to improve the quality of life of the individual by enhancing their lifestyle, by improving their ability to communicate. So just to contrast this idea of functional communication training with probably a more common model of communication skills, I want to just talk briefly about something called verbal behavior. So a verbal behavior approach emphasizes the functions of communication instead of the structure or the grammar of communication. So linguistics is primarily focused on things like phonology and syntax and morphology and pragmatics, and these things are inherently focused on the structure of language and communication. And verbal behavior is very different in that it is focused almost exclusively on understanding the purposes of communication. So I just want to make that clear that sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish between the purposes of a child's inappropriate behavior. It can be difficult to understand what they're trying to communicate because you may be too focused on the structure or the linguistics aspect of their communication rather than on the functional aspect of their communication. All right, so consider how one particular gesture or one particular word or one particular behavior can serve multiple purposes. You might have a single word that can have different meanings in different contexts. Sometimes you might scream. You might scream for enjoyment. You might scream because you're excited. Maybe you're watching a sporting event and you may scream. But you also may scream in circumstances where you need help or when you're in pain. Okay? You may wave silently to somebody to say hello, but you may also wave silently to somebody to say goodbye. These are different messages that are attached to the same behavior, okay, but they have different communicative functions. All right, so that's kind of the gist of it. The focus is on the function of the behavior and not necessarily on the structure of the language. So from that perspective, you can understand how different types of behavior can have different communicative functions. Speech isn't necessarily required for verbal behavior to emerge, but oftentimes that is the predominant modality of communication that we use. In kids with autism who are absent speech, they tend to rely heavily on problem behavior because those types of behaviors are functional and work for them. And the most fundamental verbal behavior is requesting. And requesting is about getting my needs met. It's about communicating what I want to eat or what I want to drink. It's about communicating what if I need help or I want your attention or come and play with me or come and comfort me. It's about using different forms of communication to tell somebody that you want a particular activity. Come play this game with me or come chase me. So verbal behavior and specifically requesting is the beginning point for teaching communication skills, and we can presume that problem behavior is serving a requesting function. So when a child is engaging in problem behavior, they are simply trying to communicate to you that they need something, that they want something. So you can think of a 2-year-old, a typically developing 2-year-old, who uses tantrums to meet all of their needs. They may scream when they want something to eat or drink. If mom offers the wrong drink, they'll scream louder, and they'll continue screaming until the right drink is offered. Or they might do that for a particular snack. Or they might scream until somebody comes over and gives them attention. Okay, so a 2-year-old is screaming to communicate. And some children who are taught to communicate using manual signs will not engage in these screaming behaviors because they're more effortful than using the sign. It's much easier to say, I need a drink in a manual sign for a particular child, so the child uses that form of communication instead of a tantrum. All right. But learners with autism typically lack these skills. They don't learn how to communicate or request in socially appropriate ways. They don't learn how to differentiate their crying or to begin using different words. They don't learn how to use gestures. They don't point. They don't use eye gaze. They don't use these different types of communicative behaviors that typically developing children do. And the result of that is the emergence of problem behavior. Problem behavior that is still serving some communicative function for the child, but is effortful and not very efficient. So the child has to scream a lot, and somebody has to come over and try for 10 or 15 minutes to try to figure out what the child wants before the right solution is offered and the child stops screaming. So this is a problem associated with poor communication skills and not necessarily a reflection of the child's disability. So it's a common, I think, misnomer to say that the child with autism has tantrums because he has autism, when in reality is the child with autism has tantrums because that's how they're communicating. Okay? And the response oftentimes to inappropriate behavior by clinicians, by educators, by special education teachers is to just ignore it. It's like, we're just going to ignore that problem behavior. Or you know what, we're just going to work through it. He doesn't want to do this work, and so we're just going to work through it because he needs to learn that he has to follow directions and do what we say. And we can't allow him to escape from a demand by screaming or having a tantrum, because then he's just going to scream and have a tantrum all the time. Or sometimes they might say something like, well, we're just going to redirect him. You know, if he's hand flapping over there, we're just going to redirect him back to the task and get him back on task and have him finish the work. And so there's little consideration about why these behaviors are happening. They might sometimes appeal to emotional states. They might say things like, you know, well, he's upset, or he wants control. That's a big one. I hear that a lot. You know, he's doing this for control. I've heard people kind of attribute these behaviors to the child's disability. We say, well, you know, kids with autism, they do that, they have tantrums, and this is kind of how it is. But in reality, that is a misguided approach to responding to problem behavior. If all we do is ignore, then what we're doing is we're simply ignoring the child's communicative attempts. Right? And so if the child is trying to tell us something and we are ignoring it, that doesn't change the fact that the child has a need and that the child is trying to communicate that need with us. Okay? And if we respond to emotional states, if we think, well, he's doing this because he's upset or he wants control, we're simply introducing more variables to the party here. It just becomes more challenging to figure out what exactly is causing this child's behavior. So instead of having a blanket response to problem behavior, like ignoring, we should come up with plans to understand what the messages are behind these behaviors in context and respond to those contextual factors individually. And the idea will be that blanket approaches that are not effective can be abandoned, and individualized approaches that teach communication skills can be advanced. So I just want to take a moment to talk about common explanations for problem behaviors that mislead people towards the wrong types of interventions or ineffective interventions. Okay, one thing that I oftentimes hear people who are responding to inappropriate behavior of children with autism is that he just started doing this for no reason. You know, he just started hitting me for no reason, or he just started hitting his peer for no reason, or he was just fine, and then out of the blue, he just started having a tantrum for no reason at all. All right? There's always a reason. Every behavior has a reason. Every behavior has a purpose. Okay, what we want to do is say, I don't know why he started doing that. When we say he did it for no reason, we're essentially absolving ourselves of the responsibility to investigate and understand why problem behaviors are happening. All right, so there is no behavior that occurs for, quote, no reason. There may be the appearance of an out-of-the-blue behavior, but it still has a reason. There still is a purpose. And your goal is to try to figure out what that cause is. Oftentimes I hear people talk about how thoughts and feelings and emotions or disability might be explanations for behavior. So they might attribute the person's hand flapping to their autism, right? They might say, well, people with autism, they rock a lot, or they engage in a lot of self-stimulatory behavior. Or they might say, the student is upset, or the student is angry, the child is mad, and the child is expressing themselves. But these don't tell us why behavior is happening, all right? Think about how circular this explanation is. We say the child is angry and so he hits. And so then my question is, well, why did he hit? And inevitably the response is something like, because he was angry. So the child is angry and so he hits because he's angry. And we get kind of locked into this circular logic, and there's no escape. There's no escape from that logic. We have no way of intervening. We have no way of understanding what's going on. All right, so I want you to avoid thinking about how emotions cause behavior and instead focus on these potential functions. All right, there are two broad categories of behavioral functions, relatively straightforward: getting things and escaping things. People behave to get attention, to get tangibles like food and drink or objects or activities, or they behave to get sensory stimulation, like drinking coffee or sitting in a rocking chair or riding a roller coaster or driving a car real fast, right? So those are one class of function for behavior: getting things, or escaping things. Escaping attention. I don't want you to bother me, leave me alone, go away. Or escaping tangible items. I don't want to do this activity. I don't want to be here right now. Leave me alone. This work is too hard. This work is too boring. I don't understand why we're doing this. Please leave me alone. Or to escape sensory stimulation, such as pain, or to escape a noisy environment, right? So these are classes of functions for behavior. They explain why we behave, and we can distill all the explanations for problem behavior into these 6 categories, either one specific category or some combination thereof. Now that sounds really simple, and it is a rather elegant explanation for behavior, but in applied settings, it can be pretty complicated and difficult to find out exactly why the child is behaving. But if you start with these ideas, that the child is doing this problem behavior to get something or to avoid something, then you can proceed down a path towards teaching them how to communicate. So before I get into kind of the models and show you these different models of communication and give you some examples of how this works, I just want to do a quick review of reinforcement. Now, I think everybody who's watching has a generally, strong understanding of positive reinforcement. Do something and then you get a reward. But I think it gets confused that I think people confuse that problem behavior can also be positively reinforced, right? So we think about if you do some work, then you can get some game on the iPad. That's pretty straightforward. People get that. But what confuses people sometimes is that a child will engage in problem behavior and that gets rewarded somehow, right? So a child may run around the classroom or may run out of the building and get chased. And the chasing serves to reinforce or reward the problem behavior. All right, so that's something I really want you to make sure you're focused on, that positive reinforcement has nothing to do with good or bad behavior. It just has to do with the delivery of some reward. And the reward can be for good behavior, socially appropriate behavior, or it can be for bad behavior, socially inappropriate behavior. Perhaps the most confusing thing, the largest obstacle, the most difficult thing that I run into in terms of educating teachers or consulting with them is the concept of negative reinforcement. If I can encourage you to go and read anything and master any concept, it would be this one, because I think it is the number one factor impeding our ability to effectively intervene in the lives of children affected by autism. It is this idea that escaping something I don't want causes behavior to increase. Okay, so in a very simplistic example, you might say something like, if you eat all your broccoli, then you don't have to do the dishes. Assuming the child doesn't want to do the dishes, you increase their broccoli eating behavior. Now that's a desirable behavior, that's a behavior that you want to occur. But what oftentimes is happening in the context of intervention is that a child doesn't want to do a task. The child doesn't want to do what he's told, he doesn't understand what you're trying to get him to do, or he finds the task repetitive or boring or mundane or too difficult, or for whatever reason, the child doesn't want to follow some direction and engages in some inappropriate behavior because they want to escape. All right. So child may flop to the ground and therefore avoid work. All right. So while I'm flopping on the ground, I'm not sitting in my chair and I'm not doing this task that you're asking me to do. And so the more I flop on the ground, the more I get to escape this demand. All right. So negative reinforcement, behavior that's motivated by escape from things I don't want, is probably the biggest problem confronting special educators and related service providers all over the country. Just this idea that problem behavior is continuing to occur based on a desire to escape from a situation. All right, so now I just want to kind of contrast these three models. In the top, you have kind of a traditional model that relies on emotional response as the explanation for problem behavior. Right, so some environmental factor, some environmental event occurs. It's followed by some emotional response, something you can't see, that you can't observe, an emotional response within the individual. And that is then manifested by some observable behavior. So in that top model, which I think is probably the most popular, that top model doesn't even include consequences or the factors that follow behavior. It only relies on things that precede it to explain it, and that's a problem. That's a problem because we know that consequences cause behavior and not the antecedents or so-called triggers for behavior. The environmental event in the middle there, you have the environmental event followed by some emotional response, which is then manifested by some observable behavior, which results in some change in the environment. So here you kind of have a merging of this emotional kind of idea that explains behavior, emotions explain behavior, with this behavioral explanation, this idea that consequences cause behavior. But I would say that because you can't observe emotions, and emotions are extremely complex. I mean, adults don't even fully understand their own emotional states. They can't explain why they're feeling certain ways or what their feelings are really like, or they can't put labels to their emotions a lot of the times. It's extremely difficult. To expect children to do this is even more challenging. And then layer on this factor that children with autism have severe social deficits and expect them to be able to do this, I think is just a mistake. I think it is a sticky situation that will be difficult to make any meaningful progress. Instead, we can simplify and just focus on the things that are going on before and after behavior, and we can treat the behavior itself as communicative. All right? By understanding the relationship between the environment and the child's behavior, we can understand the communicative nature of their behavior. We can understand what they're trying to tell us. So maybe if we look at some examples, this will make sense. So let's just talk, how about Charlie? Charlie hasn't eaten for a couple of hours. He really loves goldfish crackers, and he sees in the corner of the room, up on the shelf, some goldfish crackers. Now, you may or may not have noticed him looking at the goldfish crackers, and he begins to scream and have a tantrum. So if you didn't see him looking at the goldfish crackers, you might conclude that this behavior happened for no reason or out of the blue. But if you did notice him looking, you might presume that he's screaming because he wants goldfish crackers. And the result is that historically for that kid, when he started screaming, someone has come over and offered things. And that's all it takes. It's like if I scream and people start offering me things, maybe they'll offer me the goldfish. So for Charlie, screaming is serving a purpose of getting the goldfish. Let's look at Emily. Emily is asked to write her name on a paper. She hits the peer and pulls the teacher's hair. She's then taken away from peers to de-escalate and calm down. Okay? In this circumstance, we see that Emily is hitting to escape a demand. If this is going on a daily basis regularly, then we can presume that Emily has learned to hit in order to avoid the task. And maybe she started hitting because Previously, she would say no, or she would try to push the task away, and that was ineffective. Somebody continued to enforce the demand, and now she has to increase the intensity of her behavior to the point where it's impossible to just ignore. And so now she's hitting and she's pulling the hair of other people to escape the demand. If you look at Jose is told to clean up the trains. He then flops to the floor. Because he flops to the floor, he essentially avoids the transition, and he also gets more trains. So what is the message here? The message is, I want a few more minutes of trains. So if we understand that Jose is asking for trains, when we say it's time to clean up and he flops on the floor, and we know that that behavior is saying to us, I want more train time, then we can teach him a socially appropriate way to tell us that. And that will decrease his inappropriate behavior and increase his communicative behavior. If we look at Shawn's attention needs are unmet, meaning he's been left alone for a few minutes. And then he leaves the seat and he runs out of the room, and the teachers chase him. So for Jose, he's essentially saying, I want your attention. I want you to come over here and interact with me. I want you to chase me. I want to play with you. And if we understand that message, then we can replace the running with a request for attention, a socially appropriate behavior. So again, the key point of functional communication training is recognizing that problem behavior is serving a purpose, and then using that purpose in context as a teachable moment for communication skills. So this entails a multi-step process, usually that follows what's called functional behavior assessment, the collection of some information about the child's environment prior to their behavior, some details about what their behavior looks like, and the consequences that follow the behavior, how people respond, what the teacher does and what the teacher says, what the speech and language pathologist does and what he or she may say, how peers react. Those are details that are critical for understanding what the function is. Is this child getting something or escaping something? All right. So basically, what I'm telling you to do is for you to teach children to tell you that they don't want to do what you want them to do. All right. So the child doesn't want to do some work and he starts hitting himself or hitting you or screaming or engaging in some problem behavior. We're not getting any work done anyway. The child's not following the directions. The child's not really learning anything. We're competing with problem behavior. The best thing to really do is to just stop focusing on the specific task. Recognize that there is a motivational factor at play in the moment. Capitalize on that teachable moment, that child's motivation, and use it to teach them to communicate. I need a break. I don't want to do this. I need 2 more minutes. Come play with me. Okay? We can teach them these skills when they ask for them, and we can try to minimize the amount of attention or escape from demand when they don't ask for them. All right? So if we give them access to preferred activities when they ask, then we'll see a decrease in problem behavior that's caused by getting preferred items. If we see children who are engaging in problem behaviors to escape a demand, and we teach them to ask for a break, then we'll see a decrease in their problem behaviors caused by escape from a demand. If we see a child that refuses to complete a transition, then we teach them to ask for 2 more minutes with the preferred activity, and we see a decrease in the inappropriate behavior associated with the transition. All right? So it may be true that a student is feeling angry, sad, or frustrated, but I want you to remember that teaching the child to say how they feel is not going to be really effective. Teaching them what they want or teaching them to tell you what they want is going to be a much more effective way for decreasing problem behavior. Although describing emotions is an important skill, it will probably be much more beneficial to the child if you have them specify what they want rather than engaging in inappropriate behavior. This is an example graph of a child's hitting behavior and his requesting behavior. You can see the hitting behavior decreased significantly while the request for a break increased significantly. Now, eventually, when the child is fluent and is able to request a break with relative ease and we see no instances of problem behavior, then we can start to focus on getting the child to comply with our demands. But initially, we need to get this problem behavior under control by teaching communication skills before we can teach other things like sitting in your seat and following directions. Okay, so to recap, all behavior has a purpose and it is usually communicative, getting something or avoiding something. The goal is to understand the messages by examining the contexts of those behaviors, what's going on before and what's going on after, and then teaching the person a different behavior to replace their problem behavior that serves the same purpose, instead of just trying to reduce or work through problem behavior. Oftentimes this involves functional behavior assessment. So the goal isn't to reduce problem behavior as much as it is to increase communication behavior. And remember that all behavior has a purpose and sometimes serves multiple purposes. If you can treat the communicative purpose and not the behavior itself, then you'll get children who are better able to communicate and have a better quality of life.